Welcome to Section 420, Talkin Yankees. My next guest is Andrew Maraniss. He comes from a long line of award-winning writers and is a New York Times best-selling author himself. He's here to discuss his book, Singled Out, the true story of Glenn Burke, who was Major League Baseball's first openly gay player. Andrew's here to join us now to discuss his career as a writer, as well as his most recent title. So let's bring him on. Hey, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, James, thanks for having me.
Now, it's a pleasure having you. We've got a lot of great stuff to speak about. Now, people can follow you on Twitter at TrueBlue24. Now, it's blue without the E there. So it says True Blue with U24. And of course, check out your website, www.andrewmaraniss.com. That has all your background, some other interviews, and all your books. So again, pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I really appreciate you reaching out.
That was awesome, man. Of course, you're a New York Times best-selling author, and plus you're a contributor to ESPN's The Undefeated, which, if people are not familiar with it, it's a bunch of columns and blogs made that, intersectional of race, sports, and culture.
That's right.
All right. So it looks like you were kind of destined to be a writer. It's kind of your DNA. You really had no choice. Your father, David Maraniss, with the Washington Post for a long time. And of course, your grandfather as well, Elliot, read that he was the editor for the Madison Capital Times, as well as even your grandmother, book editor for the University of Wisconsin Press. So I guess, again, really, you had no choice. You had to be a writer.
Yeah, man, you've done your research. It definitely runs in the family. I grew up around journalists and authors. And so I saw that these people who I felt like were just, average people, normal people could do it. Why not me? I started writing about sports when I was in middle school. I started my own sports magazine called AJ Sports Journal, and I wrote about my favorite teams, which were the Brewers and the Packers. I did an interview, Q&A for it with John Feinstein, who I'm sure you're familiar with, as a great sports author. Now, he was a colleague of my dad's at the Washington Post at the time. And then when I was in high school, we moved to Austin, Texas, and I was played on the baseball team there at high school and was sports editor of my high school newspaper, and applied for a scholarship to Vanderbilt for high school sports writers. And it was full tuition, and I wasn't going to go to Vanderbilt otherwise, but one day I found out I won the scholarship. And so that brought me here to Nashville, which is where I'm joining you from tonight. And I've pretty much been here ever since, with the exception of 1 year in Tampa, working for the Tampa Bay Rays. But professionally, I was working in PR. I was the publicist for the Vanderbilt basketball team, the baseball team before they were as good as they are now, and then the Rays. And then I came back to Nashville and worked at a PR agency for almost 20 years, but really couldn't get that writing bug out, And so in 2014, I published my first book, which is called Strong Inside. And it's a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first Black basketball player in the SEC. When I was a sophomore at Vanderbilt in 1989, there was an article in the student newspaper about this man, Perry Wallace, who I'd never heard of before, and the fact that he was coming back to campus to be honored and recognized for the first time since he had graduated in 1970. So almost 20 years later. Imagine, here's like the Jackie Robinson, not only of your school, but of the entire conference, and you haven't honored him for 20 years. So I was like, well, what's going on there? And I was taking a Black history course at that time, and I decided I wanted to write a paper about Perry for that class, and thought my professor would say, oh, we don't write about basketball in college. That's not a serious enough topic. But thankfully, she said, go for it. And so I interviewed Perry, who by that time was a law professor at the University of Baltimore, for a paper when I was 19 years old. And then, like you said, many 2 decades later, came back to it to write a book about him. And it took me 8 years to write it, 4 years of research, 4 years of writing. But it was the best thing I ever did. I just loved that process. I'm someone that likes research. That was fun for me, interviewing Perry so many times, and his classmates and teammates. Was a really enjoyable experience, and he taught me so much about life, and especially about racism and that civil rights period of history. So it was a just thoroughly enjoyable project.
So how long, how many sessions or hours, how much time did you spend with him?
Yeah, I mean, it was a mix of everything. I would go up to DC. By the time I was working on the book, he was a professor at American University in Washington, DC. I would go up there and talk to him. He would come back down to Nashville, and we would spend time together here. I would call him, uh, email. He would send back emails like 2 o'clock in the morning. So it was dozens of times between in person and phone visits and email conversations. And thankfully, he was still living when the book came out, and so we were able to do events together, visit schools together. Come back to Vanderbilt and do events. This is a place that essentially ran him off when he was a senior in college, didn't want to hear what he had to say about how difficult his experience had been. But I was able to see a true and honest reconciliation that was really powerful on this campus.
And it became, I guess, the highest grossing book for Vanderbilt University Press. That's from what I read. So that was
Yeah,
kind of,
I mean, that's kind of like being I don't know, the best Pittsburgh Pirate right now or something. Like, I don't know. It's not like it's Penguin Random House, right? But yeah, it was a surprisingly successful book, which was really gratifying for me, especially because the big New York publishers had said they weren't interested. That this was a story that nobody outside of Nashville or the SEC would care about. And I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that because I felt like Perry's story is not just a regional story; it's a national story with so many important messages about the way we deal with each other, about racism, about the intersection between sports and race and politics, which is in the news every day now. Back in 2006, when I started the project, I don't think people really were thinking about it that much. And so, yes, I was really gratified that the book took off.
and you had a few others after that. And maybe one just briefly how you get started with ESPN's The Undefeated.
Sure. So I'm actually just coincidentally wearing this USA basketball shirt right now. My second book was on the first U.S. Olympic basketball team, which is called Games of Deception. This was at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And so it's a book about the invention of the game because James Naismith, the inventor, was there able to go to Berlin and see his invention played at the Olympics. And then my third book, which just came out in March, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is called Singled Out. It's a biography of Glenn Burke, who was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player with the Dodgers and the A's in the late 70s. My connection to Undefeated actually came through that Perry Wallace book. Undefeated is based in Washington, D.C., which is where Perry lives. When the book came out, one of the people who came to our first sort of book party was Kevin Merida, who was at the Washington Post, but became the editor of the Undefeated. He just went out to the LA Times a couple of weeks ago. But he was the one who launched the Undefeated. And he was interested in that book and that story. And that sort of opened up a relationship that I was able to pursue and pitch him some ideas. And yeah, I feel really fortunate to have a chance to write for that site.
Was Singled Out. It's about Glenn Burke. It's the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. So I actually never heard of the story before, and I'm a pretty big baseball fan. So, I mean, how did you first, hear of him?
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you. I'm a big baseball fan too, and I knew the name. I remembered his baseball card. I'm older than you, and I remembered his 1978 baseball card. I had it when I was a kid, and I think I had heard over the years, just some trivia about him that he was the first openly gay player, that he had invented the high five, but didn't really know any more of the story beyond that until I got involved in the research. I was just talking to my agent who's there in New York about ideas for a new book, and that I wanted to continue to write about sports and social issues, and in the course of that conversation, he mentioned, no one's really written a biography of Glenn Burke. And as soon as he said that, I was like, yeah, that's it. I think that would be a fascinating story about what was going on in the country at that time in the 1970s, how his story fits into that sort of the gay rights movement and the backlash to the movement. But also that era of baseball was the first one that I really paid attention to as a kid. So that was appealing to me also, to have a chance to interview Dusty Baker and Davey Lopes and Mike Norris and, Shooty Babbitt and some of Glenn's teammates from back in those days.
And, just that was kind of get into, not a big spoiler, but obviously Glenn passed away well before you got into the book. So how difficult was to put a book together of someone, again, who kind of passed away? So it was like a lot of your information is going to come from like family and friends and our former teammates. How difficult is that?
Yeah, thankfully I had just had that experience. my doubts about how to do that really sort of were with that last book about the 1936 Olympic basketball team, because everybody had passed away. I found one 95-year-old man who had been at those Olympics as a kid who watched them. But when I wrote Strong Inside, Perry was still living. Most of the characters and figures in that book were still around, so I could interview anybody I wanted to. With the 36 Olympics book, I couldn't interview anybody, so that really taught me how to deal with that, and the type of research to do that could produce the type of detail and colorful detail that you need to write an interesting book without being able to conduct any interviews. With the book on Glenn, really, he was essentially the only person in the story that wasn't still around. So most of his teammates from high school and college and minor leagues and major leagues, they were still around. Thankfully, he played for the Dodgers, which are a well-covered team. So there was a lot written about him and the Dodgers when he was playing. Also, because of his tragic death, he died young of AIDS in the mid-90s. There was a lot written about that too. So there were articles I could go back and reference, but also talk to the journalists themselves that wrote those stories, and get their recollections of what it was like to be around Glenn. He also did a book himself from his deathbed. He gave interviews to a sports writer in New York named Eric Sherman, who ghost wrote an autobiography for Glenn, in the final weeks of Glenn's life. So they didn't have time to do like a full deep dive into whole Glenn's life, but they did enough interviews that there was a lot in Glenn's own words, that I was able to use for this book.
Now, he didn't have like a terribly long career. I guess he was with the Dodgers from 76 to 78. Now I have to throw this in. The Yankees beat the Dodgers twice in the World Series there, so I got to get that dig in there. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Then a couple more years with Oakland, and then I guess he had like a knee injury, and that kind of took him out of baseball, but still a great athlete and competed in the gay games.
Yeah, Glenn was considered a phenomenal athlete. You remember Rupert Jones, who played briefly for the Yankees. Rupert and Glenn went to the same high school, and when I interviewed Rupert for the book, he said that Glenn Burke was the best athlete he ever saw. And Rupert had a long major league career, and he said Glenn was the best athlete. And it wasn't just as baseball player. He was probably a better basketball player. In high school, he led his team to an undefeated season his senior year. He would have signed a pro contract in basketball if not for the fact that the Dodgers drafted him first. He was one of the first players to play professional baseball in college basketball at the same time when the NCAA changed its rules. Just, fortunately for him, as he was the right age to take advantage of that. He played at Nevada Reno basketball, scored over 30 points in his first game after not having played for 2 years. So he had 17-inch biceps, he was incredibly fast. He set stolen base records, 2 different levels of the minor leagues. He hit over 300 5 times as a minor leaguer. Junior Gilliam, who was a longtime Dodger coach, said as Glenn was making his way up through the minors that he had the potential to be the next Willie Mays, which, that's pretty high praise, but also almost impossible for anyone to live up to. And Glenn didn't live up to it as a player, but the thing that you just makes it hard to judge, well, how good of a player was he, is he never got a chance. The Dodgers ran him off, traded him to the A's after Glenn refused to go along with a bribery plan to cover up the fact that he was gay. And then when he arrives with Oakland, Billy Martin becomes the manager and says he's not going to let Glenn, quote unquote, contaminate his team, and sends him down to AAA. So Glenn never really, had that comfortable experience in the major leagues where he could develop to be whatever player he was going to become.
And in terms of the Dodgers as well, I just read something that possibly that Lasorda, obviously passed away recently, so you never really know, that didn't like that Glenn was getting close to his son, so he kind of just wanted to ship him out of town, something of that nature.
Yeah, Lasorda's son was gay. Tommy Jr., his nickname was Spunky Lasorda. All the Dodger players knew it, although Lasorda Sr. never, publicly acknowledged it. And Glenn and Tommy Jr. were friends, and Tommy Sr. didn't like that. And so, the story goes that that's a big reason why they wanted to get rid of him. After that 77 season, you mentioned the Yankees beat the Dodgers in the World Series. Glenn had started game 1 of that World Series at Yankee Stadium. So that shows you that he was a highly regarded rookie player to get that start in Lasorda's first World Series game ever. But after it was that postseason, after that season where Al Campanis, the GM of the Dodgers, scheduled a meeting with Glenn. Glenn thought it was going to be to talk about his role on the team in '78. Instead, they offered him $75,000 for what they called a nice honeymoon, which would be a great honeymoon now, 75,000, let alone in 1977. So Glenn saw it for what it was. It was to cover up who he was. And he said, "You mean get married to a woman?" And when Campana said yes, Glenn said he wasn't going to go along with that. And then he's traded early in the next season.
Interesting. And then from what I read, it seemed like, whatever, despite the team kind of knew, teammates knew, but they still liked him. He was very popular guy in the clubhouse.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. I mean, I think even today when people talk about, gay players coming out, the question is, oh, would it be a distraction? It wasn't a distraction on the Dodgers. Dusty Baker said that they all knew Glenn was gay. He hadn't come out publicly, right? There had not been a press conference or something like that, but the players on the team all knew. And Glenn was the most popular player on the team, even as a fourth outfielder, a rookie, which would be hard for anybody to do, let alone a gay player in the 1970s, right? But they loved Glenn. He was funny. He kept things loose in the clubhouse. He loved music. He had a good boombox, that he would bring everywhere with him. This is a disco era, and Glenn was a great dancer, and they loved, having him out at the clubs with them and stuff. So when Glenn was traded to the A's, there was an article in the paper the next day, and the sports writers didn't know the real reason why Glenn had been traded, but they did recognize the atmosphere in the clubhouse. And they said there were guys crying at their lockers because the life of the team had just been traded. And to me, that was pretty remarkable to read about Steve Garvey, Don Sutton crying the fact that this fourth outfielder had been traded. It shows you how popular Glenn was on that team.
And just quickly before you mentioned that he's somewhat, I guess, the co-founder or the co-inventor of the high five. You just want to give that story a little briefly?
Yeah, so this is the 1977 season. Heading into September, the Dodgers had three players who had hit 30 or more home runs: Reggie Smith, Steve Garvey, and Ron Say. And Dusty Baker was stuck on 29 like for all of September. And if he were to hit his 30th, they would become the first major league team with four players with 30 or more home runs. And so now it comes down to the last homestand of the season against the Astros, 4-game series. Dusty needs one more homer. He's really sort of frustrated that it's not happening. He doesn't hit one in the first 3 games of the series. So now it's down to the last game of the season. J.R. Richard, at the height of his career, is pitching for the Astros. So this is not going to be an easy thing to do. And he doesn't homer in either of his first 2 at-bats, but his third at-bat, he does. And the crowd's going crazy. They know they've set this record. Glenn Burke is on deck. And he said that he was just sort of lifted up by the enthusiasm of the crowd, and he holds his arm up and Dusty slaps it. And that's considered the first high five in history. The Dodgers coined that term high five and used it on their marketing materials, kind of like the A's and the Bash Brothers, a decade later. And so that was the Dodgers thing that postseason, is high fiving. And the second high five in history took place about a minute later. Glenn Burke, I said, was on deck. He hit a home run. So they hit back-to-back home runs. And when he came back to the dugout, Dusty Baker gave him the second high five in history. There's a picture that people see a lot that is often labeled as the first high five. It's Dusty Baker and Glenn Burke. So you think, oh yeah, this must be the first one. But really, it's a picture of the third one. It took place a week later in the playoffs against the Phillies. Dusty Baker hit a grand slam. And you can tell that it's not the first one because Glenn isn't on deck. He's got a jacket on. He actually has Davey Lope's jacket on. He has a baseball cap on backwards, not a batting helmet. There's the red, white, and blue bunting on the Dodger Stadium facade, for the playoffs. And so that picture, even in some documentaries, is kind of misrepresented as the first high five, but it's the first picture we have of those two guys doing it.
What was like the impact of the LGBTQ community with him? Just, having an athlete, a Major League Baseball player just, announce that. And again, you're looking at like 35, 40 years ago. Right.
It was different than you might see now. First of all, I should say that even here, when Glenn it's kind of an open secret on the team, right? But in the off season, it's not a secret. It's open. He's living in the Castro district of San Francisco, like the #1 gay neighborhood in the whole country. Glenn's there walking around, going to bars. Everybody knows who he is. And he's very popular. The fact that there's a Major League Baseball player in the Castro is a big deal. And it means a lot to a lot of people there that he was not afraid to show who he was, when he was run out of Major League Baseball, he goes back there. And again, he's incredibly popular and he plays softball. Imagine a Major League center fielder showing up on your softball team. He leads a lot of his gay softball league teams to championships, national championships. Like you said earlier, he played in the gay games, which were kind of a gay Olympics, won gold medals in softball there too. But the tragic thing about the timing of Glenn's life is the HIV/AIDS epidemic comes along just as Glenn is settling into this post-baseball life in the Castro. And so a lot of his teammates on these softball teams are getting sick and dying. And eventually that is what happens to Glenn as well. He gave an interview to Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show in 1982, which is when he really first came out like totally publicly to the whole world. There was an article in Inside Sports magazine also. And he had hoped that this article would kind of have legs and have a ripple effect, and that might even get him a chance back in Major League Baseball. He thought that people in baseball believed that the reason he wasn't playing anymore is because he wasn't good enough, not that it was the homophobia of the Dodgers and the A's that ran him out of the game. And that once they realized what the truth was through this article, that maybe somebody would give him a shot. But that never happened. And so Glenn's life really sort of spirals out of control after that. He's hit by a car. His legs are broken. So his identity as an athlete, even as a softball player, is gone at that point. He has spent most of the little money that he made in the majors by that point. He has a hard time sort of reinventing himself. What's his next career going to be? And he experiences long stretches of homelessness, drug addiction. He spends time in San Quentin for drug possession. And so it's really, in some ways, an inspirational story, but in other ways, a quite tragic story.
And, at least now, after his death, though, it seems like, he's got some recognition against the Oakland A's. So that, the annual Pride Night is called the Glenn Burke Night. And there was a situation where MLB was supposed to, ceremonial, honor him, I guess, at a ceremony during one of the All-Star games, but I guess they said it didn't air on TV.
Yeah, this was a 2014 All-Star game. They recognized Glenn. It was the game in Minneapolis. Right. And it was all done it was done. There was a ceremony, but they didn't really make a big deal about it. They didn't show it on the broadcast of the All-Star game itself. The Dodgers, I wrote a column about this for the LA Times, have never really acknowledged Glenn. You can look on their website. There's nothing about him. They've never tweeted about him, even on their Pride nights, over the years. The A's, like you said, this year, for the first time, they renamed their Pride Night after Glenn, which is a great step. There's an Oakland LGBTQ center, which has a health and wellness clinic that they've just named after Glenn this year. So I feel like, yes, he is starting to be recognized for the significant figure that he is in baseball history. And you've seen NFL players and NHL players just over the last few weeks, active players who have come out. And in some ways, I think they're standing on Glenn's shoulders. Here's someone that had done this 30 plus years ago in, a slightly different way, but somebody had to be first, and it was Glenn. And I'm hopeful that Major League Baseball will continue to grow in terms of how it embraces Glenn's story, and that they'll tell the whole story. I think it's important that it's not just that he's celebrated for being the first, but that we understand the homophobia in the game at that time and how it prevented him from becoming the full player he could be. And we don't want that to happen to the closeted gay players who do exist in Major League Baseball right now. Who knows if they're becoming the best player they can be, not knowing what their reaction might be around them. And if they choose to come out, you hope that their teammates will kind of have that attitude of Dusty Baker and be completely supportive.
And, the book came out of March of this year. What type of feedback or, responses have you gotten from people about it?
Yeah, it's been great. That's a sort of a nerve-wracking experience of having a book come out and waiting to see what the reaction is going to be. The reviews have been really positive, which has made me happy. I've had a minor league baseball player read the book and say that it inspired them, and they're thinking about possibly coming out this year. There was a review, I've gotten reviews from like baseball types of sites and publications, but also LGBTQ, and outsports.com had a really nice review saying that it was the first time that they had seen, people and events that matter to them in their lives told in the context of a baseball story, and I'm a huge baseball fan. I feel like this is American pastime, right? It should be for everybody. And this is another way of showing that it's for everybody, and putting it into a context of a group of people who have been marginalized and left out of that baseball conversation.
You mentioned before you had like 2 Yankee stories.
Yeah.
Want to share them?
So my first trip to New York, period, involved the Yankees. I was born in Wisconsin. We moved to the East Coast when I was growing up, and I was still a Brewers fan. And so I don't know if you remember 1981, the strike season, they had kind of a different playoff scenario where they had a first half winner and a second half winner of each division. And so we lived in Washington, D.C., and my dad and I took a train up to New York for all 3 of the Brewers-Yankees games of that series. And here I'm 11 years old. It's 1981 New York, which is different than 2021 New York, and so it was a little bit intimidating for me, but so much fun. I still remember the smell of the pretzels and the nuts that they're like roasting outside the stadium. And I show up in my Brewers cap, and in the row behind us, these Yankee fans were burning Brewers caps, so all of a sudden I just take mine off and sit on it. I think there's some pictures of this next event too. There was a fan that jumped out of the third base stands and attacked an umpire with a blackjack, in one of those games. So it was a real welcome to New York moment for this little innocent 11-year-old kid. But I loved it. And I loved old Yankee Stadium so much. I thought it had the best, to me, it had the best sound of any major league stadium, just that deep bass, in that stadium. And unlike any other stadium, and I missed that when I've been to the new Yankee Stadium. My second story was in 1998, the year that I worked for the Tampa Bay Rays. It was their first season. And I was the media relations manager for the team. Towards the end of the year, I had decided I was going to come back to Nashville to get married and sort of have a non-baseball life. And so my going away present from Larry Rothschild, who was the manager of the Rays, later became the Yankee pitching coach, he let me take batting practice at Yankee Stadium. It was the early BP, so several hours before the game. And Frank Howard, Hondo, was the pitcher. And the real Rays were hitting, and then I just joined the group, right? And they were all bunting the first pitch. And so I thought, well, I should bunt the first pitch too. And I squared around, and Hondo pulls up halfway through his motion. He's like, just swing the bat, son.
Andrew, appreciate discussing your book. Again, the book is called Singled Out. It's the true story of Glenn Burke. And again, it's available on your website at www.andrewmaraniss.com, as well as wherever books are sold. And I just want to say one thing. 40 years later, the pretzels smell the same, and the Subway definitely smells the same.
Probably literally exactly the same. 40 years
exactly
later,
the same.
Right?